Here to cover all things crime, history, and politics, we are At the Desk. I'm your host, Emily Koza, and in today's episode, we'll be talking about the candidates on the Canadian ballot and touch on the unique election districting structure, prohibition, Larry Nassar, and the two largest progressive movements in the United States. Now come take a seat with us at the desk. Welcome back to ATD. First, we'll be sending it over to our politics panel as they head up north to dive into the candidates on the Canadian ballot for their ministerial election in October and touch on America's unique election districting structure known as gerrymandering.
Thanks, Emily. I'm Ryan Lowy, joined alongside Yaya One, Jackson Tortone, and Jordan Spagnoli. This October, the 10 provinces of Canada will have the opportunity to elect their executive leader of government in the 45th Canadian federal election. Justin Trudeau, Canada's 23rd Prime Minister, is running for his fourth term, having served as Prime Minister of the Great White North since November 5th, 2015. However, Trudeau and his Liberal Party are facing fierce opposition from Conservative MP Pierre Poilievre, arguing Trudeau is weak on crime in Canada's largest cities, has a failed environment initiative in place, and is failing to address rising interest rates. So, Jordan, tell us a little bit about Trudeau, who is now trying to, for a fourth consecutive time, hold office.
Yeah, so definitely he's one of those more liberal candidates that we're seeing. He has a lot of social policies, strong advocacy for feminism, abortion rights. He did introduce physician-assisted death, believe in religious freedoms, banning conversion therapy, making it under the criminal code illegal. He's in favor of legalizing marijuana. His idea on that is tax it, regulate it, safer that way. He also has done a lot with gun control, prohibiting the sales of assault weapons and making background checks instead of being only 5 years, a lifetime. So definitely a lot of more liberal policies that he's introduced. And then he also has some outlooks on climate change, where he's trying to get emissions to be a net zero by 2050, which it's not looking like he's going to make it there. But so pretty much he came into office with a lot of liberal ideas, ideologies, policies that he wanted to get passed. Some of them he's been able to do, others not necessarily getting to where they want to be, but overall he has been really trying to push more liberal policies.
So, Jackson, we're now going to talk about Poilievre, who, as we know, he's gotten a little aggressive on social media.
Oh, yes.
He's taking the exact opposite side on the political scale. He's directly to the right, and he wants Trudeau out. Tell us a little bit about him.
So Poilievre is the exact opposite of Trudeau. So he's been in Parliament since 2004. He's been the leader of the Conservative Party, of the opposition party, since 2022. And yes, he is a staunch critic of Justin Trudeau and all those liberal policies. He's against the social policies. He's against the gun control policies. He's against the failed environmental policies, as many people believe. And he has a decent shot, even though Canada is considered a very liberal country and has been for decades now. He's making a pretty good stand against Trudeau and what he's kind of established there as this kid from Alberta. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens in this upcoming election for sure.
Right. And even though Canada is known as being super liberal, I think we've been seeing a bit of a wave of populism in the world recently. So I think it'd be very interesting to see if Canada falls to that as well. But talking about their elections look a little bit different from ours. So like Jackson mentioned, Canada has a parliament that's a little bit different from our Congress. So when election season rolls around, we have our Governor General, who basically has the power to dissolve government, and government in this case being the parliament itself. And dissolving government means that they cease all action. So they're not running during the election season, which is a little bit different from ours because Congress is still passing laws and still in session while we have our elections. But so the Governor General dissolves Parliament, and then you have our candidates who are Poilievre and Trudeau, and they start campaigning, which, interesting fact, actually, Canada's candidates have to campaign for at least 37 days, but no more than 51 days. So I thought the limit on that was pretty interesting. That's not something that we do here. I'm not I don't believe so.
We're very into our political parties here.
Right.
The way their structure works, they have 5 major parties scattered across their political system, and the party that wins the most MPs gets to put their leader in charge. Right. And obviously, as we've known, and what's been interesting is, as we're talking about Trudeau trying to hold office for a 4th consecutive time, this could be a 3rd consecutive time where he's in a minority party and he's still able to hold power, which I think is very interesting as well. So now let's move on just a little bit more into Canada. Let's talk about what you guys think are the major problems Canada's facing and why you're supporting that individual. So Jackson, first tell me what you think the major problems are here. Compare them to what you think the problems are in Canada and who you're really supporting and backing.
Here's the thing. Canada has some similar issues to us. I mean, they have some issues with, immigration. They have issues with, like healthcare. They have issues with housing costs. Inflation is a really big issue. Their inflation has been rising just like ours has been. And so that's something that a lot of the conservatives are pressing against Biden and against Trudeau, just because they think that their economic policies are too liberal, too government involved, and they're causing problems for the middle class and such. So I think that those are going to be some of the biggest issues and some of the, the commonalities between Canada and the United States. So I think that's going to be probably his best bet, or at least Poilievre, to go off when he's campaigning.
Yeah, and I think Jackson mentioned immigration. I think that's a huge thing because obviously the U.S. does have a large influx of immigrants, but so does Canada. And Trudeau himself wants to allow more immigrants to come into Canada, but I know with, again, the rise of populism that I mentioned before, it's harder and harder for candidates who are in office to push this idea of letting more immigrants into a country, especially with inflation rising, and it's like, who do you prioritize? Mm-hmm. And with this movement of refugees coming from maybe the Middle East, some coming from Africa, some coming from all over the world, how do you balance letting people in and giving them asylum versus making sure you prioritize those within your borders?
Well, especially because they're facing a housing crisis. So It comes into this whole, we want to let them in, we want to give them a safe space to be, but also you have to think about your people. Where are they, where are you going to house all these people? But I agree with you guys. I feel like there's a lot of similarities between the United States political system and Canada's. And we see a lot of similar issues. And it's just, I feel like here, there's a little bit more right and left give and take on those issues, where these past couple years, we've been seeing a lot of more liberal-leaning leaders taking on these different issues, whereas I like how in the U.S. we have that kind of push and pull back and forth to try to find a better middle ground, whereas it seems in Canada it's not necessarily like we're seeing a big middle ground right now.
Right. But our friends up north seem to not be very happy with what Trudeau is doing. So even though we look at them as being very liberal, it seems like that's kind of shifting a little bit.
It seems to me like they like his personality, they like his, his intentions, but the execution has not been great over his last 3 terms.
Well, he's been there for a long time, and I see the similarities, across federal elections. We're talking about U.S., Argentina, and now we're talking about Canada. There's been that current liberal leader that everyone's just been frustrated with. People like to vote with their wallets. Republicans like to resort to their wallets. Republicans in this certain situation, or I should really say properly, leaning more to the right. They like to get a little bit more aggressive on social media. They like to get more aggressive in speeches. They like to be a little bit more funnier. They like to entertain with common policies of people voting with their wallet, complaining about the border. So we're seeing very similar elections. If it started with Donald Trump, if it didn't start with Donald Trump, if it started in Minnesota all those years ago when that WWE wrestler became a governor, we can talk about that another time. But let's move on. Let's talk about gerrymandering. So let's dive right into gerrymandering, and it's much different than Canada because Canada has 338 Canadian electoral districts. We have a lot more than that. However, differently alongside that, I'm freezing. I'm going to restate that. Canada has its 338 Canadian electoral districts. We have a different amount of districts, and we also redistrict them every 10 years. Can you guys tell us a little bit about it?
So basically, gerrymandering is this practice that has been regarded as being deeply undemocratic, and it's where politicians or a certain party in a certain area will redistrict their maps and draw them differently to give advantage for one party over another. And they have 2 different types. There's cracking and packing. Cracking being splitting up groups of the same demographic across multiple different districts so that their voting power is less concentrated. Packing being the opposite, where they pack groups of the same demographic to increase their voting power, if you know what I'm saying. So recently, actually, the governor of Wisconsin, who is a Democrat, Tony Evers, just signed into law a new map of different legislative districts that kind of evens out the maps because it seemed to be leaning more towards the Republicans. And these maps have been in operation since 2011, and they were actually regarded as being among the most gerrymandered maps in America. So Tony Evers, who was said on record that he was going to make sure the maps are evenly distributed, meant it, and the reason that Wisconsin Democrats were able to do this actually is because of the appointment of the Chief Justice Janet Protasewicz. I'm sorry.
We've had our fair share of difficult names this episode, everybody. Don't worry.
Okay, for sure.
Protasewicz, basically, she ruled that the districts in Wisconsin were actually not contiguous, which means that some of them were not geographically connected. So you had two places in the same district that weren't geographically connected. And so that's the only reason why Democrats were actually able to redistrict.
Yeah, and I mean, kind of going off what you said, a lot of the times we see this redistricting because it's trying to split up minority groups, or it's trying to favor a certain incumbent, or it's trying to reduce spending and funding for certain groups. I mean, any way you look at this, whenever the districts are being redrawn, depending on who's in office at that time, they're doing it to their favor. And it usually has a negative effect on citizens. I mean, you have minority groups that are getting split up, and so the people that they want in office aren't necessarily getting in office because their representation isn't fairly shown based off of these districts, which seems to be a continuous problem that we see with gerrymandering in the United States. And I know some states have laws and rules against kind of how you can and can't redistrict, but a majority of states don't.
Yeah, before you go, Jackson, bouncing off of that, 13 U.S. states exercise nonpartisan or bipartisan redistricting methods.
Yes, so you have 34 state legislators that have direct control over their own district lines, and 39 have direct control over their own congressional districts. Then you also have states like Maryland that appoint a 9-person committee to assist the governor to rewrite the congressional state lines. You have places like in Idaho, Michigan, Montana, New York that have independent commissions. Then you have some like, Connecticut, Maryland, Illinois, Mississippi who have backup committees to the other committees. Like there's definitely a huge diversity in how these lines are written. And that's how gerrymandering occurs, is because there is some form of corruption within those committees by someone in control. And that is how, like you said, minority groups are discriminated against or split up, or, an incumbent is attempting to stay in office. And yeah, this is how it's done in practicality.
This is one of these problems that we've been having. Political parties are manipulating not just districts, but they're honestly just manipulating our government. And we've been seeing it for many years with our electoral college. When our founding fathers drew it up, George Washington said it best. He said, I don't want political parties. I think people are going to vote not off their conscience, not off of what they want the American people to want, but what their political parties want. So I think that's just the most unfortunate part of the whole thing. And this is obviously evidence. Every 10 years, different states have different rules of how to manipulate their districts federally. And we're seeing it take effect in government. Many states are putting representatives who really, honestly, if you district it properly and proportionately, don't deserve to be there.
But that begs the question, should there be more federal oversight over the redistricting of different states? Because as we know, this is a states' right. This can bleed into a states' rights issue because states are the ones who do control their voting processes. But if we see so much, and Ryan, I'm going to use your favorite word, corruption.
Yes, I love that word. Sorry, continue. It gets me excited.
Within these processes, if there's so much corruption, so much underhanded dealings going on, is it time for the federal government to step in and add maybe a little more rules and regulations to make sure this type of stuff doesn't happen? I mean, luckily we have Tony Evers, who managed to split the districts evenly between Republicans and Democrats, but as we can see, not everybody's going to be doing that.
Roughly, they represent 700,000 people. And additionally, what you stated, 10th Amendment will get pushed into that one as well with states' rights. So that's another issue. The state legislators are not just going to want to throw away power like that, where they can really benefit their political party at the federal level and not just their level of the state.
But see, I think you guys make an interesting point there, because it's the states' rights, and what state is going to, like you said, throw away that power? So how do we get rid of a process? How do we get rid of this? How do we get rid of gerrymandering? Because it's not doing any good for anyone, really. But how do we get rid of it whenever the people who are in charge of it are never going to give up that right? And that's kind of the issue that we see ourselves falling into, because this isn't a new issue. This has been talked about for how long, but nothing seems to change, because this is power. This is how you get reelected. Why would you give that up if you want to get reelected?
Yeah, it's been that, and obviously, as we mentioned, the Electoral College. They've been talking about getting rid of those two forever, but the way our Constitution divides powers, some states are never going to let it happen. In some situations, parts of the federal government that need to take actions wouldn't let it happen. Obviously, we talk about how you can amend the Constitution. Very difficult to do that. Yeah. 2/3 both branches.
And that's kind of the cost of living in the United States, and like living under this, republic. It's not really a democracy; it's a constitutional republic, and that's part of it.
Absolutely.
That the states do have a good degree of power. And it is very difficult, given the fact that they've had corruption issues, and I know you love that word, and they've, in the 1900s, they used gerrymandering to discriminate against Black Americans a lot of times in the South and other states, and it's been something that people have wanted to fix, but yes, like you said, amending the Constitution is one of the hardest things to do in our government, and I can't really see it happening within the near future. But people will certainly try.
Right, but going to gerrymandering specifically, we have a lot of voting rights activists who are trying to bring more awareness to this issue, and I think that's why it's very important that we're talking about it today, because not a lot of people who are eligible to vote understand that this is happening, and yet voting is a right that is afforded to every single American, barring if you are a convicted felon, of course. But every single American has the right to vote.
Even that's a states' rights issue now.
Right, and that's something that we need to protect, and getting rid of gerrymandering is the only way that we can ensure every American gets to, or every American's vote counts in a way that matters to them.
Absolutely. Well, we can talk problems with America's current federal election system all day long, but unfortunately tonight we were not awarded that privilege. Back to you, Emily.
Thanks, Ryan. Stay tuned for a brand new panel to talk all about the two most progressive movements in American history. We'll be right back at the desk. We are back at the desk. Now it's time for a brand new panel to compare and contrast the Black Lives Matter and civil rights movements. Over to you, Jackson.
Thanks, Emily. The Black Lives Matter movement and the civil rights movement have oftentimes been compared and contrasted to each other by politicians and the media. This leads us to beg the question, what are the similarities and what are the differences of the two movements? To answer this question, I am joined by my co-hosts Jordan Spagnoli, Joy Donald, Yaya Wan, and Brandon Cuck to break down both. So guys, the civil rights movement started in the 1950s, as we know, and was one of the most progressive movements, and one of the most important movements in American history. Black Lives Matter started up back in 2013, so during all of our lifetimes. And so they've been oftentimes compared and, what are the differences, and, what are the similarities, and, how is one better than the other? People have asked these questions so many times. So I'd like to start with you, Jordan. What was one of the most important events in the civil rights movement?
Yeah, so I definitely think an important part of looking back at our history is being aware of these crucial moments that helped build us up. And so when we look at the civil rights movement, we look at the case Brown versus Board of Education. This was one of those landmark Supreme Court cases in the United States, which was decided in 1954. It was definitely one of those pivotal moments with far-reaching implications for the desegregations of public schools in the United States. They argued that segregation was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment under the United States Constitution, because in schools, you want equal treatment, and if our students are being segregated, that's not equal treatment, that's not fair to anybody. But so that was one of those one of the big moments of the civil rights movement that really helped kind of push this movement of desegregation and just more equality.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I kind of really want to build on another section of one of the really big civil rights movements, the Tuskegee Airmen. So it is a little bit more of a known group, but so they were active in World War II, and they were originally not allowed to become pilots because they were all black. But Eleanor Roosevelt was able to go to the president, and she was able to put in a good word with him, and she was able to get them out on their first mission, where they actually were, they had the least amount of deaths out of any of the other troops in World War II, and that was a really big, but a little bit of a smaller segment that was really important for World War II and for the Civil Rights Movement.
So I actually wasn't familiar with that. That's very interesting. I'm glad you told me that, yes.
Yeah, so the Civil Rights Movement was very important, and it had a lot of focus on desegregating America, and that's one of the things, Jackson, as you were talking about how these two movements are compared, that's a bit different from Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter, there was a lot of focus on police brutality, and this phrase that has become so iconic in our era first showed up in 2013 when a organizer from California posted about Trayvon Martin, who had been killed in 2012. He was a 17-year-old kid walking home from the grocery store. He bought a packet of Skittles, and George Zimmerman, who was patrolling the neighborhood because of a series of break-ins that happened, spotted him. He called the non-emergency line of the police, said this kid looks suspicious, followed him, was still on the line, and the officers on the line heard gunshots. When the officers arrived, he was dead on the scene. And this is where the post came about that said Black Lives Matter, and that just took, and then America took that phrase and turned it into a whole movement.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you think about the Black Lives Matter movement, it's very important, especially in recent American history, and it's very comparable to MLK's movement. I believe that it most became prevalent in America in 2020, though. I think that's something we all can agree on. Obviously, in 2014, it was very important, but in 2020 is really where it hit its pinnacle. After the murder of Breonna Taylor in March of 2020, that's when it started to spark up again. And then with the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020, it hit a new kind of height. I mean, we were all there. We all saw all of the protests that were happening in Minneapolis. They were happening in D.C. They were happening in New York City. They were all over the place. But these protests, they were met with a lot of resistance, just as MLK was back in the day. And some of the big resistance movements were like the Blue Lives Matter, the We Support Our Cops, All Lives Matter, White Lives Matter. Any lives matter that aren't black, essentially, was what they were throwing at the wall and seeing what would stick. And there was a lot of backlash in this country that was faced at them, that it was included in that. And in that backlash, one of the biggest things a lot of people would say, the naysayers of the Black Lives Matter movement, is they would say that this is not what MLK would have wanted out of a protest for Black Lives Matter. And I personally don't agree with that, but that is up for discussion on the panel.
I agree with you completely, Brandon. I think one thing that people overlook every single MLK Day, January 15th, we have quotes. I dream that one day my children will live in a world where they're judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. That is a quote that I see every single year on MLK Day without fail. One quote that I almost never see that is spread by politicians, your run-of-the-mill white liberal, is his quote, "Riots are the language of the unheard." We all know that picture of Minneapolis on fire, and everybody was in an outrage that they're looting, they're breaking into Target and stealing things. But MLK said it himself, riots are the language of the unheard. Why are we worried about people going into Target, which is, by the way, like a multi-billion-dollar corporation, and stealing essentials and not listening to the message behind why they're there? They're there because every single day, people that look like them, people that might be related to them, people that they know, are being killed simply for walking around being a little darker skinned. I can't tell you how many times my mother has been on the phone with me and said, "I'm really scared for you whenever you're in school because I don't know what's going to happen to you. I'm all the way in the Ivory Coast, and you are darker skinned than a lot of your peers, so I don't know what's going to happen to you." So saying that MLK would not have wanted the Black Lives Matter movement to manifest the way that it did, sure, he was in favor of nonviolence, but saying that he would not have agreed with it is erroneous and, quite frankly, very dangerous.
Well, see, and I think that's an interesting point because, like you guys said, people are saying, "Oh, this isn't what he wanted. He does, nonviolent protests." He wouldn't have wanted this to be a situation we're facing now in this current times. I mean, he spent his life fighting for equality and rights, and of course, the civil rights movement was more focused on that desegregation equality, whereas the Black Lives Matter movement's a little bit more about fighting back against this police brutality. But I think what people are missing is he wouldn't want this to be an issue in the first place. He wouldn't want to see these people being murdered for no reason. I don't think he would be mad at how the country is responding. I think he would be mad that this is a problem that we're facing in the first place.
Yeah, I'd have to agree there. I think another key comparison and I guess a contrasting point too is the two different goals of the movements, and this is something we've all discussed together, is about how with Martin Luther King Jr., he was trying to get rights for African Americans, right? Because there were no civil rights laws in place when he started his movement. So the goal there was to get the legal rights of African Americans. The Black Lives Matter movement attacks at a different angle, whereas they already have the legal rights established, but the morality of the world and the way that racism and people are moving in the United States, it still exists, and it's still very evil, and it's still a thing that we have to deal with. So it's important to notice that there's two very different things going on.
And I'm really glad you brought that up because, yeah, that's something that we kind of have to separate here is that both movements want the best for Black Americans. That's what they both, openly stated. Both movements want, Black Americans to be happy and to be safe, most importantly. But yes, in our modern day, Black Americans do have the same rights on paper, obviously, that white Americans do. But yes, the Black Lives Matter movement has been primarily concerned with the police brutality and just the violence that Black people have to endure every single day in this country. So I'm glad you brought that up, Brandon.
Yeah, honestly, even though we might have the laws and on paper as other people of color and as other people in the U.S., it really doesn't mean anything if we don't have the same mentality and everyone's being treated fairly. And I really feel like that's the main message on both sides of each movement. Every movement is always about creating equality for both sides involved. It's not ever about having like someone being better than the other. And I feel like that's the approach that a lot of people, the mentality that we need to take. And I feel like that was the main part that I feel like just disagrees with the say that MLK wouldn't have wanted the Black Lives Matter movement.
Right, and I'm glad you brought that up actually, because Brandon also talked about All Lives Matter, and I think it's very important to talk about the reactions that people, and I will say a lot of white people did have towards both the civil rights movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, is this idea of disruption and how that does not lead to progress. Protests are meant to be disruptive, and I feel like we've kind of strayed away from that idea. Something that Martin Luther King knew very well is that while there is inequality, you're not supposed to exist peacefully and just go about your day. And that's one thing that we see a lot with the BLM movement, is that people were making noise about it and making sure this is a problem that we think is important, and until it gets addressed, like, no justice, no peace. That's where that comes from. And we think about Martin Luther King in our day and age as somebody that everybody loved because of his nonviolent philosophies that mirrored Gandhi's, but 63% of Americans did not like him. They did not appreciate him. He was called a troublemaker. He was called a disruptor of peace. And that's what I think a lot of people forget in our day and age as well, is that these responses that we're seeing today with Black Lives Matter, it was the same thing in the 1950s and the 1960s. So that's something that's very important to me, that they're not as different as people think of them, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that the biggest problem that America faces as a whole, at least in my opinion, is just ignorance in general. Now, obviously, there's ignorance, the idea that people are equal, but I feel like there's forced ignorance by the people of the United States, too, where the attitude towards the Black Lives Matter movement is largely that it doesn't matter, they have equal rights, why are we still making a fuss about this? You know, that's why book burnings are happening in Florida. That's why they don't want people to talk about it in school, because they don't want it to be brought up whatsoever. And that's where the real danger comes in, when the ignorance starts to take over and it starts to become, we should try to forget this because it doesn't matter anymore. I feel like that's probably the most dangerous thing happening in the country right now.
Well, and I think you kind of bring up a good point too, is it's not even just that ignorance, but also I think people have a hard time accepting, like, yeah, there is a problem. People want to keep living in this world, like these different movements we're talking about, Blue Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, White Lives Matter. These are all things that came up after the Black Lives Matter movement started. And I think people are just getting so defensive about it. Yeah. We're not saying that not everybody matters, but that's not what this movement's about. This movement isn't about the general population. This is about a minority in the population that has been treated in a way that people shouldn't be treated. And I think that was another part of that problem with this current movement, and I'm sure that was a problem with the civil rights movement. People don't want to accept responsibility. They keep on moving forward saying, yeah, but, not yeah, but, yeah, this is the situation. Now, how are we going to fix it?
Right, exactly. And I think you said that so perfectly. And I want to bring it back again to Martin Luther King. Another myth that is pushed about him is that he was colorblind. And that's where we have this idea of Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. This idea that we have to overlook our differences, that being different means you're deviant, means you're straying from the norm, and that's something that needs to be ignored, overlooked, even quashed. And again, I'm going to bring back the content of character, not color of the skin. Martin Luther King was not colorblind. He was not somebody that said, I don't see color. In fact, he acknowledged the differences in people of color and people of color all around the world. And he said, this is a thing that's happening. We need to address it, and it's causing problems. We need to address it by looking at the color of people's skin. He wasn't saying, let's just ignore it, but saying it shouldn't matter as much as it does. And I think that's a very important distinction that needs to be made.
Yes, well, you all are very educated. You guys provided some very great points today, and I loved hearing them. Well, we hope you enjoyed our look into two of the most progressive movements in the history of the United States. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Back to you, Emily.
Thanks, Jackson. Stay tuned for our history panel as they debate the legal drinking age. We'll be right back at the desk. We are back at the desk. Now it's time for the history panel as they discuss prohibition. Over to you, Drew.
Thanks, Emily. Here at the desk, we do not condone underage drinking. However, around this time of year, we here at Penn State celebrate State Patties Weekend, in which almost everyone partakes in drinking culture, both of and underage. It's a weekend of camaraderie in which many memories are made, just to be immediately lost to a binge drinking spree. The question is, does the prohibition of folks under 21 help or hurt students? Now, as the only person who is 21 years of age, 22 years of age.
23.
Thank you, Brandon. 23 years of age, thank you.
How high are we going?
I think
Yeah.
30?
I would just like to say that
35?
I do have the privilege of drinking legally. However, I do want to ask you guys as the panelists, do you think this prohibition is effective? And what do you think we can learn from prohibitions of the past? I want to start with Jake.
Well, as kicking things off, I'd just like to say I'm Jake Santora, and I absolutely think that we should be keeping the drinking age at 21.
Well, I'm Yaya One, and I believe that we should lower the drinking age.
I'm Audrey Keller, and I'm with Jake. I believe that the drinking age should be 21.
And I'm Brandon Cuck, and I am Team Yay over here. I believe that we should lower the drinking age to below 21.
Now, we all know of Prohibition. It was something that happened around 1919 that was started by the temperance movement, and essentially what it was a group of women who said, we don't like our husbands coming home pissed drunk and beating us anymore. So they brought it into effect, and there are 2 amendments in our Constitution that essentially say, hey, drinking is illegal, and then the 21st Amendment, which says, hey, you can start drinking again. And it ended around 1933.
It's ironic.
I know, right? 21, yeah.
Amendment.
18,
It's pretty good.
21st, right? And so, but, people still wanted to drink that, and it led to the creation of things like speakeasies, moonshine distilleries, though granted, if you drank too much of that, you'd go blind. But what I want to ask both of the sides, before you guys enter the general discussion, is the prohibition of people under 21 fair? Does that even matter if it's fair? And do you hold this position for reasons of health, morality, or just general safety when it comes to students here at Penn State?
You guys go first. Go.
Well, honestly, I think it's a perfect age, because you have to consider there's also something that's becoming very, very popular throughout the world is Zins and cigarettes. All 21. You buy it at 21. And you can make the argument, oh, well, I'm 18. I get to vote. I'm 16. I can get my driver's license. Yeah, but it's a drug and you're putting it in your system. You think voting's going to kill you? No.
There are a lot of benchmarks put in place of progress in this country.
It's something that will affect your body, and that's a detriment. And I honestly think that's why it, is held above the rest.
And drinking affects others as well. Your drinking is not a lone thing.
Yeah.
It may affect you physically, mentally. It can also affect others if you decide to take your inebriated state on the road, or like in the 1919s when the women were mad that their husbands were beating them fairly.
Absolutely.
Do you want to start?
Yeah,
Let's see what the other
I'll
side
start.
has to
Well,
say.
if you want to talk about health, there's one thing that we really can talk about, and it's the fact that at 18, there's something you can do that isn't drinking. It's called going to war. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of it on that side of the panel.
Jeez.
But going to war, that can get you killed instantaneously, bad. But drinking, if moderation, it can be done healthily. So I believe that the health detriment is inarguable. Also, because if you look, 32% of college students already have fake IDs, so they're already consuming alcohol as it is. And lowering the age from 21 to 18, in my opinion, would make alcohol consumption for those college students our age healthier. Because then they'd be doing it in public places where there's bouncers, there's bartenders, there's security, they're keeping an eye on them. And if they get a little bit too tipsy, then they got to get kicked out. You can't do that when you're drinking at home and you're hiding. It's just the truth.
Beautiful points, Brandon. But let's take it back actually a century, 1920s, Prohibition era. What is something that people will do when you tell them not to do something?
They'll do it.
They'll do it. They'll do it. And as we know, Prohibition was arguably the most catastrophic failure in United States history, because actually alcohol consumption between 1910 and 1921, this is World War I era, was actually steadily dropping, but it shot right back up as soon as Prohibition came into effect. So again, people are going to drink regardless. And when you ban something, when you tell somebody you cannot have this, they're going to do everything they can to have it. And what does that lead to? That led to them making moonshine in their closet, which is dangerous. As Drew said, you can go blind from that. You can die from that. So how is it better to ban something and have people search for it in secret, and the effects and the potency of these drugs go up?
Unregulated.
And people are dying because they can't do it legally. Right. You need that regulation in place to make sure that people are safe.
To be fair, with government regulation, alcohol levels haven't dropped since then. It's not like, oh, well, now that we don't need to make moonshine anymore, we still have things like tequila, vodka out on the market today. But let's see what the other side has to say.
Well, you talk about lowering, I'm sorry, I just have to bring it back to this. You talk about lowering regulation, but at age 21, they've actually done studies where there's estimates of up to 1,000 people per year that have their lives saved due to not being able to drink till at the age of 21. So I just want to throw that in there since we're talking about regulations.
I also think, if we're talking about regulations and prohibition, there is a modern day prohibition that is in effect and does work. Let me just... I would like to say,
Wow.
if you are a soldier, like you brought up, men can be drafted, women can be drafted, they can go into the Army at 18. Great point. You're very right. They can do so. I'm going to turn this off. This is distracting me. Sorry. But you're so shocked that I pulled that out. Anyway, in the Army, there's a thing called General Order Number 1. That is it is a modern prohibition. If you are a soldier in a combat zone, where men would be the most affected day to day by the horrors of war, you are not allowed to drink. You are supposed to be sober. This does help. It's really funny how you bring up needing alcohol almost as a crutch to get you through.
No, I don't think I said it as a crutch.
Now you're committing a logical fallacy. That's ad
yeah,
hominem right over there. You're not actually attacking our argument.
Do you know what ad
You're calling
hominem
us
means?
Alcoholics. My family's Muslim. I can't even drink.
Hey,
so
did not call you an alcoholic in any way, shape, or form.
You
Run the
basically
tape.
said that we need alcohol as a crutch. So if that's not alcoholism, let me ask the audience
let's-
if that's not
And I
alcoholism.
did
What
not
is it?
say you
All right,
personally.
let's reel it in a
I would never suggest that you two
But you did.
have drinking
I
alcohol.
think she was just representing the genuine argument that you're trying to have about that lowering drinking is going to make alcohol such a it's already a huge part of the culture at Penn State. Let's take this school, for example. Everyone drinks here, whether you like it or not. Half the people here aren't 21, and guess what? I bet many of them have drank. So if you're lowering that, it's going to become more of the new normal, which is what you're trying to push right now. And I completely disagree with that. People don't need alcohol to have fun, but by lowering the drinking age, you're going to be promoting the idea that it's going to be relied on, and it's going to entice kids to get it more.
Not necessarily. I mean, we talk about giving out condoms in school, right? Just because you give out condoms in school doesn't mean that you're going to invite kids to have sex at 14, 15, right? So it's the same thing. When you make something easily regulated because it's easily accessible, then that doesn't necessarily push people to want to do it more. Actually, it could have the opposite effect. And we see it now. Like you said, everybody at Penn State drinks despite the fact that the drinking age is 21. So if that regulation isn't doing anything, like Brandon mentioned, 32% of college students have admitted to having a fake ID, which, by the way, is criminal. Why don't we just lower the drinking age so that criminality leaves and people are not as incentivized to do illegal things anymore?
I mentioned a statistic that 1,000 lives are saved every year from the 21 drinking law, which I don't know where you got that statistic from, but I'm a little skeptical of it, to be frank. I have to say that I believe, personally, if you lower it to 18, I think you're completely glossing over the fact that I brought up it's safer conditions for drinkers. If you're drinking in a public forum, you are less likely to get alcohol poisoning and overdose because you will be cut off by the bartender. That can't happen when you're hiding in your own home drinking your parents' liquor or something like
Granted,
that.
that is up to the discretion of the drinker as well.
Yes,
Because you can pretend to not be as drunk as you actually are. But I wanted to bring up something in particular, binge drinking. I know that, when I was 18, because I think I can say this, right? When I was 18, I was doing stuff that was really dumb when it comes into regards to drinking. And so I think that if you give access to alcohol to people who are 18, do you think that they would abuse this and engage in binge drinking, or do you think that they would more likely learn to temper their resistance or their resilience towards alcohol?
On that point, right now there is a drinking trend called the Borg, a black outrage gallon.
That's what it's called.
Sorry. So clearly, safety and 18-year-olds drinking, they're not able to drink, but 18-year-olds having the ability to get their hands on alcohol, safety isn't in that equation for them. And we can see this on this campus too. Like, for example, in October, when a girl was needed by the EMTs at a frat party because she was unresponsive due to alcohol poisoning.
Well, in response to that, let me tell you something I did just last year. Just last
What
year.
did you do just last year?
Just last
Brandon?
year,
What's gonna add
I
to your argument
hopped
here?
on a pretty little American Airlines airplane, and I sailed my little ginger butt right over the Atlantic Ocean, and we landed in Ireland.
Yeah, sorry.
We landed in Ireland,
Okay.
and I hung out and I went to some pubs there. And I was completely legal to drink because I was 20 at the time. And I hung out and we had a few drinks. I have to say that everyone there that was my age had less drinks than me. And I wonder why that is. Oh, because they've been drinking longer, so they know how to handle themselves in a more responsible manner, rather than having them do it illegally up until they're 21 and then throw them to the wolves when they graduate.
And Brandon,
college.
you're right. They don't know how to use it in a responsible manner right now. There is not a way that we can transition from having open alcohol being closed off into it being accessible to everyone. Or
But
else
there is.
everyone
In the rules, but there is. Because if kids who are 18 years old do have that access, then again, having it legal and having them have that access, it helps them make mistakes. At our age, we're supposed to be
Make
making
mistakes in high school? Because that's what you're doing. There's already kids who are underage.
May I
from
finish?
Okay, yeah, let's finish off.
Thank you.
Let's hear your horrible
So
my God.
basically, I lost my train of thought, Jake.
Sorry.
So basically, when you have that access, you have people that are there, like Brandon said, who can monitor them and not hold their hands, but say, hey, listen, if you need help, if you feel like you've done too much, like you can come to us and we can help you. Because when you have this illegal element to it and you have kids who are drinking underage, when they get in trouble, they don't feel like they have anyone to turn to because they're drinking underage. So it's like, oh, shoot, I'm going to get in trouble. I could possibly be fined. I could possibly go to jail. So let me just not say anything. And that can lead to overdoses. That can lead to alcohol poisoning. So you need to have that element of a safety net for young kids who maybe have gone overboard. Because let's face it, everybody's going to make mistakes at some point. You don't get
Right,
your first
yeah.
drink and you know what your limit is immediately.
Right.
But giving them that freedom to find out what their limit is and then have an adult come to them and help them without that fear that they're going to be punished in some way would help a lot.
But we don't have, logically right now, there is not, like, I will come back to your point, to speak off of what Brandon was saying in Ireland about drinking. I lost my train of thought.
Well, I can pick it right up.
No,
for
you cannot. Brandon, I was
you
speaking.
said it was lost.
Hello?
Has it been found?
It has been found.
Okay, go ahead.
So,
Shoot. Go ahead.
okay,
We're
so
eating
talking
running out
about
of time.
Ireland and talking about the USA, they are completely different countries with completely different cultures.
Sure.
There are so many different things in play here. There's too many factors. We can't say that everyone will be responsible and be able to turn to a trusted adult if they were able to drink earlier.
But more people would be able to.
But you have to keep in mind this has been implemented for so long. You're looking at countries like Italy. I actually have a good foreign exchange student friend that I met last year who goes to Italy. That has been in their system. That has been a part of their laws for the longest time. And it is not, yes, it's a part of their culture, but at the same time, they can do it responsibly. Have you looked at what happens whenever kids have drinks right now?
In the United States.
Yes, exactly.
I feel like this is a chicken and the egg kind of situation where we think that the irresponsibility comes because of the laws, and you guys think we can't change the laws because of the irresponsibility. So I just want to put some statistics out there that are non-negotiable in terms of morality and legality, because that seems to be what we've been debating so far. These are purely economic. During Prohibition, Alphonse Capone, otherwise known as Al Capone, don't know if everyone knew his name was Alphonse, but there you are.
Thanks for
He
giving
made about
me
$100
update.
million a year off of illegal imports.
That's
$1.4 billion going to the pocket of a
2018.
gangster. And here's another thing, 32% of college students have admitted to having a fake ID. Keep in mind that's probably a low ball number because it's only 32%, and that's only people that are admitting to it. 95% of those IDs are from overseas. And if you would estimate that maybe each of them costs like $50, that's a lot of money going over to China and Japan, just saying.
Alrighty, that's all the time we have for this segment. Whether you agree with the prohibition or not, we can all agree that maintaining that upbeat spirit of state patties as we enter our spring break. Back to you, Emily.
Thanks, Drew. Stay tuned for our crime panel as they cover Larry Nassar. We will meet you back at the desk. We are once again back at the desk. It's time to send it over to our final panel of the day, the crime panel, to discuss the case of Larry Nassar. Over to you, Savannah.
Thanks, Emily. I'm Savannah Barr, joined by Ryan Lowy, Eva Hines, and Katie Schreiner. Larry Nassar was a former sports doctor who worked with the USA Gymnastics national team and the Michigan State University. He became infamous for sexually abusing hundreds of young female athletes under the guise of medical treatment over a period of many years. The abuse occurred under the pretext of providing legitimate medical procedures, often involving medical pelvic examinations and treatments for various injuries. Nassar's actions came to light when survivors, including prominent gymnasts such as Simone Biles, Aly Raisman, and Michaela Maroney, courageously spoke out about their experiences. Nassar had also used his portion of trust and authority to exploit them all for his own sexual gratification.
Well, I think when talking about this case, you have to talk about the girls. The girls are what make this case. There were more than 265 women that spoke out saying that they believe that Nassar sexually abused them. But really, cases started back in 1990. It's not just him. There are multiple people within the gymnastics community that have been going through this. The first case that we heard about was from Amanda Tomashow, who is an MSU graduate. In 2014, she placed a Title IX complaint about him. But there were no charges. It was considered medically appropriate what he was doing. Nothing happened until 2016 when he was fired after there was an article released on the Indianapolis Star talking about their experiences with people such as him. Then when you get to the trial, you had multiple people coming forward. 18 victims filed the lawsuit. This includes Jessica Howard, Gabby Douglas, one of the biggest names in gymnastics, Alyssa Baumann, Simone Biles, Aly Raisman, Michaela Maroney, and Maggie Nichols. Many of them testified, and it's crazy to think that now they went for the $380 million settlement, and the girls, they've gotten what they need, but there's still stuff going on in this case today.
I don't know. I don't know if they got what they need. I mean, if you watch the witness statements, which we'll get into later, one girl said that unfortunately she didn't feel close to her father when he committed suicide. A lot of them went through depression. Can money buy happiness? In this case, no.
Yeah, so I kind of want to talk about how he got away with this for so long. So like, as you mentioned, Katie, he had so many victims that spanned through so many years, and I feel like a lot of different things went into how that came to be. So the first thing I kind of want to touch on is he would let the parents in the room sometimes when he was performing these acts. So he would kind of turn the girl the other way, and the parent might be like a foot over. So there was kind of this big thing about like, well, how was there abuse going on if the parents were right a foot away? And another big thing was he was an expert in his field, and he was the official doctor of the USA gymnastics team. So he abused his power in that position to basically control everyone. Who's going to speak out about that? Everyone was so scared. These girls had worked their whole life for these opportunities, and they don't know, like he could blackmail them. He could blackball them in this field, and that could ruin their life. I mean, probably from like the age of 3, they've spent money on these gymnastics trainings. Even for me, like doing musical theater, I grew up spending money on voice lessons, dance lessons, and they put so much of their life and hard work into this profession.
They put so much of their trust into those professionals.
Right. And to say something, they were scared to speak out. He was so well respected. Everyone loved him. If they said something and it went south, they just destroyed their whole career. And that was a big thing. And another big aspect, I think, of why this went on for so long is the FBI failed to do their job. They had, in the beginning, a lot of complaints from certain girls, and they just ignored them. They took Larry Nassar's side. They really weren't open to opening up this case, and I feel like that's a big reason that this was going on for way longer than it had to.
And I think it's really interesting, just the lack of accountability. So many allegations were made to him to Michigan State University, and countless times they did absolutely nothing for it. And in one case, one victim even came to their parents, and their parents advised them to not do anything about it. I think that goes back to just the industry in general and the fear of speaking out.
Well, this leads up to the big court case, which I think was and crazy court case. 3 different cases, prosecuted federally, in which he received a 40-year sentence, but then we move over to the state of Michigan, and this is where things get crazy. Larry Nassar, he said he was innocent. He attacked Judge Aquilina. He said she was just trying to get attention. He said that these witness statements were all lies, and that a lot of them were fabricated, and that they were exaggerated. Obviously, this was all not true. You know, he pled not guilty. He was told to change his plea, even by Judge Aquilina himself. When she read his witness statement, he wouldn't change it. But it wasn't just him who was wrong at this trial. It was also the Michigan State President, Lou Anna K. Simon, who showed up, said she didn't want to cause drama. Instead, she deflected blame. And in fact, instead of causing drama, she extended it to a heavier degree. She eventually then resigned after the trial, many weeks later. But it was a total disaster. People spoke out about her. It made the university look bad. And this is where we talk about accountability from our highest institutions. We were talking about it in Operation Varsity Blues. This is a whole nother level.
Well, that's something, talking about the president, that's not okay. If you have some people coming forward, students coming forward, talking about being sexually assaulted on your campus, you should be taking accountability, understanding this is their story.
They didn't take it seriously. They took Larry Nassar's side. They were rooting for him.
Which is absolutely awful. I understand he was in the field since 1986, but that doesn't mean you should take his side automatically.
And I think that they were scared that it would make their university look bad. But at that point, it's like, who cares if it makes your university bad? Yeah, you already look terrible, and you should do what's right.
1,000%.
Yeah,
I mean, she waited till after the trial to resign. She should have resigned immediately. Like, the whole thing was just an absolute mess. But I really like what Judge Aquilina said when she prosecuted him. She said, 2,100 months. I just signed your death warrant. That's what she said. She was avid. She was clearly a fan of sentencing him since the beginning. So as the trial went on and she saw the behavior of many of the parents frustrated, she stood up, she said, we're going to do this the right way, we're going to take care of things, we're going to put him behind bars. She signed his death warrant. Larry Nassar has been having a rough time in prison. He was attacked in prison, and you know the story goes on still to this day with how Nassar's been treated.
Yeah, he was attacked in prison, which is why he was moved to a different prison in Florida. But another thing that I just think is so interesting is just kind of like the impact it had on all the girls and their families. I know we kind of touched on this earlier about all the drama and like the court and everything that went on, but it just, these people are scarred for life, like we talked about earlier. And I just think the whole impact this whole situation had is what makes this crime so horrible.
And I think to add on to his crimes and what he's done, the amount of child pornography he was found to have on him, and even allegedly sexually assaulting a family friend's child for years.
Actually disgusting. Actually, the worst case by far that we've covered, I swear. This is, it's so disgusting because he gets away with it over and over and over again. This is one where it wasn't like people had everyone just decided to believe that he was fine.
It's unfortunate. It's so connected to the Jeffrey Epstein case. Power gets away with abuse.
Absolutely.
It's the saddest thing. It's so unfortunate how in our society, when you reach a level of power in some sort of organization or you reach some sort of respect, you know, people just ignore some things you do. Even when they see in plain sight, parents said they knew his image. They knew he was this very powerful, you know, doctor that everyone respected in the world of gymnastics. And, you know, parents watched him as he abused their daughters, but they were like, well, you know, he's so respected. This must be what's supposed to happen. It's so unfortunate, the whole thing. Obviously not using gloves, putting his hand in places they absolutely should not be. The whole thing was just disgusting. And when you watch documentaries of the whole thing, you go, I can't believe this happened for 20 years. He did this in front of people's faces. And all that had to happen was one person. One person of prominence just had to speak up and tell the right people. It never happened.
Yes, and these girls would go to each other and be like, oh, did this happen to you? And they'd be like, yeah, and it kind of just became normalized. And that's just kind of what they all thought was the norm. And that is another reason why this just went on for so long. And like I said earlier, just the power he had. He was so well respected. He had his degree. He was very well trained. And he was able to go in there and write everything off as like a medical procedure. He was able to use words and terms that people didn't fully understand and write it off as some
crazy medical procedure that he knew how to do and no one knew what else was going on.
And I like the way the New York Times mentioned his status. They said he was a celebrity-like figure in the elite gymnastics and sports medicine world. That's the perfect way to describe it, and that's how he got away with it. Just like we were talking about earlier with Jeffrey Epstein, he had a celebrity-like status just generally. So people were scared. Law enforcement, when he was on probation and parole, they were scared to step up on him when he was, disobeying it and still committing his crimes. Larry Nassar's committing crimes in people's faces, but he's a celebrity. He's a bigger figure than me. He knows what he's doing. He's got to be doing the right thing.
And to add on to that, so many of his victims were also well-respected celebrities, like Simone Biles, yet they weren't listened to. They were completely overlooked, despite having their influential status.
No, it's crazy. Everything that went on, is, like you said, with Simone Biles, all these reputable names that they just kind of flew under the radar.
Well, it's a tragic case overall, but also thinking about those families, thinking about how they were impacted. We saw it in one of the trial days, a father of 3 gymnasts going over the fence and trying to hit Nassar.
Let's put a little bit more description in this situation. He said, "Judge, I know I'm not supposed to speak. Can I speak?" The judge said, "Sure, you're granted 5. You're granted a minute." So he goes, "I need 5 minutes in a dark room with him, locked room." And she said, no. He goes, how about 1 minute? She goes, still no. It's unconstitutional.
Right.
That's abusive. So then he goes, all right, I'm going to do it myself. Stepped over a sheriff's officer, stepped over a boundary, attacked Nassar, was just feet away, seconds away from getting his fist on Larry Nassar and really hurting Larry Nassar. The sheriff's office pulled him away. He was thrown down. He was arrested. They did not press charges. They did not open up a separate case. I think, honestly, personally, if I was to rewrite the Constitution, if somebody did something that bad, he deserved to get hit there.
Well, he was a monster.
Yeah, he was an absolute monster.
When I watched that video, when I watched that video, I could just feel like how that father must have felt in that moment. I had to be like, that's valid. The way he must have been feeling about his 3 daughters, who all were put through Larry Nassar's reign, it just it hit me. I was like, wow, he must be feeling every single emotion possible. And what else could he do? He just wanted to lunge.
It wasn't just the betrayal of trust with one daughter, all 3.
Yeah, right.
That's where it hits so much different.
Right.
And just the betrayal of being an authoritative figure.
Well, the thing that I take away the most, it's not the crimes he committed, it's how long he got away with the crimes.
Unfortunately.
20 years.
But Ryan, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. Back to you, Emily.
Thanks, Savannah. Sadly, that is all the time we have for today. In the meantime, stay updated with ATD on all of our socials and let us know what you want to see us cover next. I'm Emily Koza, and we will see you back at the desk next week.